there was a loneliness that came with really being a compulsive gambler that I don't think is easy to quantify, because people like to look at the money with gambling, but you could also justify the loneliness of saying, well, I didn't want to hang out with that person anyway, or I'd rather be gambling. But I was missing things that I enjoyed, like playing basketball with friends. I would find an excuse because I'd have to be on my phone looking at the scores of games or placing that next bet.
Welcome to the Generation News Podcast. I am your host, James McLamb. I'm here with a new good friend, Saul. How are you doing today, Saul?
Doing excellent, James. Thank you for having me on here. Looking forward to our talk today.
Well, Saul, you reached out to me and we connected, and your story resonated quite a bit with me, and I'm really excited about exploring that, because to be honest with you, it's not something I thought about as a major issue. It should have been something I thought about, but your story, and we'll dive into that in just a few moments, just really resonated, and I'm glad to be able to have this discussion today. But before we do that, my audience would love to hear from you a little bit about you. So if you wouldn't mind, take a couple of minutes and share with them a little bit about you and who you are.
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. So my name is Saul Malek. I'm 26 years old. I live in Dallas, Texas, originally from Houston. And I've gotten into this whole youth speaking space within the last 2.5 years. I was a college student at a small school called Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, where I developed an affinity for sports betting that quickly evolved into an addiction, really derailed my college career, which we'll talk about pretty soon, I'm sure. And I got clean right before my senior year from my gambling back in 2019. And from that point, I started seeing more and more of gambling in the media, especially among young people. And so I thought, well, you see the speakers on drugs, you see the speakers on alcohol, you don't see them on gambling all that much. And so that's how it all started. I went back to my high school, gave a presentation, and then from there it's grown to where I'm speaking around the country now on gambling and addiction, mental health. So it's really cool to be able to have some sort of platform and be a voice of hope for younger people and parents as well.
You're right, Saul, when you said that you'll see speakers on drugs, you'll see speakers on alcohol, you'll see speakers that'll talk about mental health, you'll see speakers that'll talk about sexual issues on campus. But really, I do not know of anyone tackling the gambling problem with youth until I met you. And it's got me thinking about this, about since North Carolina, where I live, has allowed for sports gambling, how I cannot open an app without an ad from FanDuel's or any number of different apps. And you can bet on everything there. So if parents and adults are not concerned about this, they need to be aware of it, that it's another thing that we need to be putting in a toolbox. So I think to start this discussion, if you could just share the journey of how you start from there to get there, because I think it would help our audience if they could hear what you went through and maybe have some ideas of some signs that they can be looking for along the way.
Absolutely. So to give you all a little bit of context of how I ended up there, because I don't think anyone is born compulsively gambling, as far as I'm aware. So I grew up in Houston. Like I mentioned, my parents have been together for over 30 years, provided a very comfortable environment for me and my twin brother to grow up in, had everything we wanted, very supportive parents. And I'd say my journey really starts from, I want to say about 4 or 5, because around 4 or 5, I was clinically diagnosed with ADHD. And I had an impulsive side that was evident from a very young age. You know, I would blurt out random noises or make random movements and things, and it caused disruption as early as, I want to say, like kindergarten or the end of preschool. And that's the start of where that there was anything, I guess, concerning about my behavior. But granted, this is before I'd ever placed a bet of any form. I started really with any sort of inkling of gambling with fantasy sports in middle school. So I think most people know someone or they themselves are in a fantasy football, fantasy baseball league. And I explicitly remember my mom said, well, if you're going to do that, then no gambling involved, right? This isn't anything to do with gambling. And I said, well, no. We put in $20 at the start of the year, all me and my buddies, but we didn't say wasn't gambling really. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So, we
Kind
had
of
our,
like a pool,
yeah,
just
yeah. It's like,
pool.
you just put it in to start. No one really cares. It's
Yeah.
more just do it with your buddies. So that was fine. That was encouraged. My parents thought it was great how I took such an interest in sports. I wanted to go into sports broadcasting and everything with, as a career goal. So my impulsive side, I mentioned I had the issues with impulsivity and I kind of jumped around and talked about fantasy. Well, I went off to college in 2016 and I was struggling to find something that made me feel cool, made me feel in with a group of friends. Everyone was starting to drink, drug, and hook up. And I felt like I didn't really participate. I wasn't in with all that. And so, I used my fantasy leagues as kind of a crutch to stay in touch with my high school buddies because I wasn't willing to give that up yet. And all of a sudden, one of my friends who I'd done fantasy sports with reached out and said he knew a bookie, someone who takes sports bets.
Oh.
And I thought, well, he asked if I wanted in. And I thought, well, what the heck? $10. I mean, I didn't have a job. I was in college, but I looked at it like I would going bowling. It was entertainment money. So I convinced myself why I know who's going to win this baseball game that night and put in the $10. And let me just tell you about that feeling, because this is important to the story, and this will then directly translate to the impulsive nature and how that was a real big red flag of how that escalated. So that first bet, I was on my school's broadcasting network. I was a host for our sports show at school.
And
And
this was it. This was at college in San Antonio,
college
right?
in San Antonio.
Yeah.
And yeah. Well, the context of it. So I was there in my suit, man. I had, the nicest clothes on, ready to go on the air. Mr. Big Shot, the next Stephen A. Smith. And when I had that sports bet going at the same time of being all dressed up and feeling super cool, it was like the $10 bet didn't feel like $10. It felt like $1,000,000. When I checked that score and my team was winning 9-0 in the second inning, I was like, oh man, I know what I'm doing. I'm the king of this. This is my thing. And I was bragging to everyone in the studio, yo, I got this bet going. And as soon as our broadcast ended, the game was not finished yet. I ran as fast as I could to the computer lab in the building and was on game day checking the rest of that baseball game. And I had to replicate that feeling. So, that weekend football was on, okay, $20. I won 10 the first time, but I thought if I won 10, I can win 20. I won a huge underdog, Bears over the Steelers back in 2017. Shouldn't have happened, right? It was a big underdog. And here's where my impulsive nature starts to kick in, because you think of gambling. It's a risk, right? Anyone who watches this may, I've been to Vegas and put in $20, and that's my entertainment budget. If I lose, I lose, big deal. But I didn't rationally think any of that out. It was like, I love this feeling. I love this action. I'm ready for the next bet. I'm ready for the next bet, and it went from there. So that's how it got started. I got introduced to it in college. The fantasy leagues were something that I had been a part of since middle school. And I just sort of dove into sports betting without an end goal, without a budget, without anything, just the need for that thrill and that feeling.
So what were some of the signs that people around you, if they had known what to look for, could have seen that was happening to Saul, that they could have said, hey, buddy, this is not going well, before it got to the point where you hit a wall and said, hey, this is not going well? Because we all know in all addictions that early on, people around us see the problem before we see the problem. But in this case, with such a nuance, I hate to say new, because gambling's been around forever, but in the format that it is, it's relatively widely acceptable, accessible than it used to be. So what could they have seen?
So that's an interesting question. And the first piece of context to this one is that gambling, sports betting, is not legal in Texas. So naturally, people wouldn't think this kid in Texas is even going to have access to it. So that's the first challenge, I'd say, in getting to the answer to that question. But I would say if they were to be on the lookout, if they had their guard up that this guy has a problem or he's quickly headed to having a problem, I think the first thing that they would have to see was the frequency in which I was talking about my wins, my betting. And that is a commonly noted sign. Someone who's going around constantly, they're talking about how much they won gambling. And then that was starting to dominate a lot of my conversations with my friends, was how much I was winning. And I was posting things on my social media, which could have caught some attention from people. I was posting pictures of screenshots of the transactions with the bookies. If the guy Venmo paid me $200, I would post it on my Snapchat story and with green check marks or some hardcore rap music. And again, I mean, look, I know everyone has their own
If anybody's
responsibility.
listening for the IRS, we'll just ignore what he just said.
I mean, it was pretty small time money in the grand scheme of things, but I'd say, of course, I know everyone has their own issues, so it is hard to catch everything in someone else. But the preoccupation with gambling, I'd say for my parents, seeing the transactions, because I was depositing money into my bank account and then I would take it out to make some of the payments. And my mom did actually raise a question about that. She said, "What is this? What is this deposit? What is this Venmo?" And it was very easy to explain away by saying, "Well, it's just some sports betting on the weekend. It's kind of casual stuff. It's not really a big deal." So my mom raised the concern saying, "Well, in your family history on my dad's side, my dad's biological father, compulsive gambler, and very miserable, sick life because of his gambling." So my mom reminded me of that fact and said, "Hey, this is potentially problematic." So that's another risk factor as well, though, is having that family history of it, of addiction and gambling. So it was noticed to some degree. I think part of the problem was not in noticing that it was starting to build up or that it was even happening, but part of the problem was not recognizing the seriousness of the problem itself.
Mm.
Because if it's just gambling and you're not losing that much money yet, or you've always been a big sports fan, well, then people around me are kind of used to that. That's almost par for the course for me, is being obsessed with sports and being a little bit impulsive. But I don't think anyone in my inner circle would foresee that this could be a fatal addiction, something that would have life altering mental health consequences. So I hope that is at least a starting point of an answer to that question, because I think, like I said, the preoccupation with the gambling, the bank transactions, spending more time in isolation because I was always on my phone looking at the sports bets, that isolation is a big factor. And I think that aligns with what I know about other addictions too. You spend more and more time isolated, tending to
Yeah.
that addiction.
So you mentioned just something about mental health consequences. Talk about to the audience, what are some of the consequences of this? Because I can hear some people rationalize the same way that you were. Hey, it's not that big a deal. It's low level. It's just a casual thing. And I wrote down when you were talking, I was thinking, what are all the ways that kids could do this? Lottery now is a form of gambling. Obviously, they can. Oh yeah, where the odds are clearly stacked against you. Fantasy sports, obviously, even all major sports sites now give odds, which is something totally, you know, 10, 12, maybe 15 years old, maybe as many as 20 years old. They have segments now on game day. Hey, what are the odds of this person? Where they used to not have strictly odds givers. They would say which one was favored, but the stuff. But so talk about some of the mental health things, that the consequences and any other consequences that you encountered and you see others maybe encountering as well.
Well, it's a good point you bring up first and foremost about people rationalizing it. And I know I
Yeah.
rationalized it. So before even getting into the mental health consequences, I think it's important to know people in this line of advocacy, so to speak, I think should expect to be treated like Debbie Downers, not helping hands. If you're a speaker on drug use, I think there's widely favorable feedback. And I know that there's a lot of favorable feedback for those in the gambling awareness education space. But there is also a lot of pushback of who are you to tell someone what to do with their money? Or,
Yeah.
it's just fun and you're just bad at it. You're just a crappy gambler, which I think takes away the merit of the potential of addiction. But when it comes to the mental health side of it, speaking for myself here, it was very subtle to me that it went from something that I eagerly anticipated doing, because early on I was so ready for the next day, because that meant that my bets for the next day would be going and I would just repeat the cycle again. It was like I'm ready to get high the next day pretty much, right? Because that's essentially what I was doing through gambling, was getting high. But very subtly, I mean, I remember, I want to say only a few months into when I had started toward the end of 2017, I was unable to get a bet in on a basketball game on time. And it caused such anxiety in my head that I didn't have action going. And I was pacing the floor of the
Wow.
laundry room there in my dorm, like, God, like, I need to get this game in. Oh, I can't wait, and all this, and
That sounds almost like an addict who can't get a hit.
yeah,
Can't get
yeah.
their hit that particular day. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it was and it was stressful. And the thought I had wasn't, oh, well, this means I need to stop. It's like, well, this means I need to have another bet so I can keep the action going and satisfy that urge. But when it comes to how distorted my thinking was, that's one of the most alarming things for me looking back on it. I always like to say that I've considered myself a well educated person, someone who has decent common sense at least. But I was putting myself in very hazardous situations as a result of the need to get a fix with gambling. There was a time toward the later stages of my gambling career where I would drive through San Antonio going to the sketchiest pool halls and bars and ask the bartenders or the people there, hey, do you have any bookies? Do you have a contact for a bookie? And I would make something up. Oh, I'm new in town and looking to start sports betting. I wouldn't tell them, oh, I already ran off on 10 of these college kids I owe money to or anything. But getting involved with very seedy people who I didn't know in a big city like that, and then giving out my personal information to them to try to win their trust. I mean, that's a serious that's jeopardizing my well-being, my safety, and my family's as well. And I found that there was a loneliness that came with really being a compulsive gambler that I don't think is easy to quantify, because people like to look at the money with gambling, but you could also justify the loneliness of saying, well, I didn't want to hang out with that person anyway, or I'd rather be gambling. But I was missing things that I enjoyed, like playing basketball with friends. I would find an excuse because I'd have to be on my phone looking at the scores of games or placing that next bet. And it really was something that required so much lying to maintain the addiction, because there's no honesty that can go along with being actively in addiction. And so, I'd have to make up how much I owed, or make up things to friends and family about if I stopped or that I was going to stop. And it plagued my mind. And it got to the point where eventually I felt like my conscience was just being eroded by the need for that next fix, or to stay in action. So it's like, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you have like shelter and food and water and friendship and all that, it's like gambling superseded all of those things. It's like that next hit. And there's a chemical component to it. I'm not a neuroscientist or anything, but I've just seen very basic science about it, is that release of dopamine. There's that hit in the
Yeah.
brain. And it's like that feeling of being on cocaine or something. So it's, quite literally a chemical dependency.
I don't think people can really understand the depth in which something like this can draw people in. And I started jotting down even more sites that I thought about that's accessible to our young people now that's never before, basically through the use of technology. I mean, poker sites have become more and more. I didn't even think about that in our first discussion, but when you hit it, I thought about, traditional gambling, people go to a seedy place and pay pool or play poker. Well, I remember when ESPN and other sports sites started showing the World Series of Poker. it became massively big. And on all social media feeds, you begin to see ads. Join this site, join this site. So these people are trying to draw you in to do this. Video gaming, all those have an aspect of that. So there's so many different aspects of this. If a parent or an adult sees someone that they think is a problem, how should they address it? Help us out. Give us some hope here, Saul. We need some hope. we're like, oh my gosh, how are we going to face this? So let's give some hope. What do we need to do? Give them a step one.
Sure. I think step one, first and foremost, is having that conversation with the kids. And it almost sounds too obvious. It almost sounds too obvious.
You see, I'm glad you said that, because I hear that so many times. Oh, just talking is that's just not going to get it. But it is step one. Thank you for that.
Sure. I mean, you have to approach it before you can do anything about it. And what I like to do, and I'm not a parent, but I speak to parents at a lot of schools, and I speak to a lot of students at a lot of schools. And the feedback that's been positive for me has been finding a way to approach the subject in a way that is engaging, where kids don't feel threatened. So, for instance, there's so much media right now about gambling. And so to be able to bring it up from that lens of saying, what's going on in the NBA with the Jonte Porter scandal, where some NBA basketball player is in trouble for fixing games for gambling. And now he's been kicked out of the NBA for good. Being able to use topics like that as a case study for how serious this gambling stuff can be, how it can get, and then using that as the entry point to talking about, well, what does your behavior look like? Or when we're watching sports at home, what does that do to you when you see all these advertisements? Just having these conversations in a way that is organic and in a way that's an ongoing conversation. Because part of the problem, I think, is I know for me as a young person, I didn't like the lecture where it's like, well, don't do this or don't do that.
Yeah.
But if it's an ongoing collaborative talk about, well, this is what's out there, these are the risks, and we're working together so that you don't fall into this, rather than just don't do this, don't do that. What are your thoughts on it, right? To the kid, let's get some understanding of how young people are interacting with this stuff too, because I think it's important to hear what young people are experiencing rather than just telling them what to do.
This is something we probably I should have asked earlier, but I'm bet a parent sitting there listening, I'm glad I don't have to have this conversation because my kid's never going to do this. What percentage, do you know what percentage of young people are involved in this in some way or another?
So the NCPG, National Council on Problem Gambling, had said in the past year, 60 to 80% of high schoolers gamble in some way. And that's a wide range. So,
whoa, what do they mean by that? What do they mean by that?
They meant, my understanding of it is they meant just participating, experimenting at least in the past year with some form of gambling, whether that was placing a sports bet, whether that was participating in a poker game. So it's a sort of a broad scope that they're talking about there. But there's data there from the California Council on Problem Gambling that says gambling at an early age significantly increases the risk of developing a gambling problem later in life. So you have 60 to 80% of kids who are even experimenting in gambling, and then you see that their risk is a lot higher than people who start gambling as adults. And the highest risk group is young men. 10% of young men in the U.S. have signs of a gambling problem.
All right, step one, have a conversation. Anything else? What if you're the kid? Let's go there. And you're realizing, how do I get myself out of this hole? Because I talk to a lot of different people in this podcast that are talking about helping folks get out of their situations. And there's a recurring theme that sometimes when you're in the hole, you can't even see the light coming down from above. You don't know where to go. You don't know what to do. So let's throw them a rope, give them a ladder. What can we do to help them start that journey?
Well, let me back up and give a little more of how my story progressed. And I'll give the abridged version.
Oh, I love this.
To give a little more context of my own experience. So I had mentioned those first couple of bets were successful, and then I was gambling for a little bit of time, winning, losing some, making the payments. For me, it got to where when I was online, because I was betting on sports online, and I was given an account through a bookie. They had given me an amount of credit, and then at the end of the week, that credit was either paid to them or they would pay me the money. So that's a little of how it worked. And I found online that I was able to gamble on more than just the sports that I knew about growing up. So I could now start betting on tennis or betting on darts. Even online, you can bet on horse racing overseas and
You
things.
can bet on the election.
Yeah, I heard you can. So
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. You can bet on just about anything. And so going back to what I said, I was impulsive and I like the thrill of it. I like the rush of it. I like the idea of being able to win these random tennis matches. So anyway, as you can imagine, as the bets piled up, the losses started to pile up. And so it got to where whatever money I had saved up that my parents had given me when I went off to college, I had exhausted that on gambling. And so I blocked the person I owed money to, and then I still needed to gamble. I still had the fix, so I'd go find another bookie through a different contact and run up a bunch of debt with them, block their number, find a new one, and so on to where I ended up owing a dozen bookies, and I'm still making payments to pay off some of that debt now. I still make my payments. But in that whole evolution of my gambling, it got to where I was essentially forced by my parents to go to a Gamblers Anonymous meeting in 2018, right before my junior year of college in August of 2018. So when you're asking, and this all does relate to your question of how you get yourself out of it or how to start looking for help, that was how I was first introduced to any sort of help. Was that my parents were seeing that I was starting to require bailouts when the pressure became intense from some of the bookies, and they saw that it was plaguing my relationships in my life. So they were the ones who told me, because in my head I thought I could still figure it out by just placing another bet, winning it all back, paying everyone off, being even again. But I went to the meeting and I didn't really take it all that seriously. And after 2 weeks, I rewarded myself, having not gambled for 2 weeks, I rewarded myself by placing a tennis bet, thinking that it wasn't that big of a problem and I should be able to celebrate my accomplishment. And so, pretty much from August 2018 through that entire next year up until like July of 2019, I would go clean for a little bit, then gamble again. And there were times where I did think this is really painful. This is painful and I need to stop. But then when I'd stop, it's like my life was just grim. I owed all this money. I had my relationships in turmoil. I didn't derive any pleasure from normal activities like basketball anymore because I needed that high from gambling, which I no longer had. So then I would just go back to gambling. I'd say what really finally got me was just the depth of the pain I felt from my gambling, from my actions. It was so severe. I lost a girlfriend. I lost, of course, all this money, and I still couldn't stop gambling. And I felt like this is a really doomed life I have here. Was running out of hope. And what I've heard before is if you don't have any hope, you won't live very long. So even if my hope in the past was misguided, hey, I'm going to get out of this by winning the next bet, at least I had something driving me forward. But then I was really running out of hope. So I thought either I'm going to get clean from this or I'm going to die from this. Like this is going to be something that leads me to take my own life because I was feeling suicidal toward the end of my gambling career because it was so bad. And really that first step then was giving a legitimate effort to Gamblers Anonymous for me. And, I'm not here to say that GA is the only way or that, GA is for everyone. But for me, it was very useful because it got me out of my own head. So, no, that's kind of a word salad there. But I think really the first step for someone who is looking to get clean from an addiction is having enough emotional pain. Emotional pain is really the touchstone to making significant change.
So really, I mean, and I love
So,
what you're saying. The emotional change was what caused you to change. It really needs to be the adults in that person's life being observant enough and involved enough that they can intervene and have that caring conversation that doesn't feel threatening before they get to that point. So we need to be aware of those types of things there. So tell our audience what you do currently to raise awareness for this and help provide some solutions and some answers stuff. What are you doing as you're going and speaking and engaging with people?
Absolutely. So you can see, I think my website is there plastered on the screen. Maybe you don't see it. I see it. So if you go on my
I see it.
website, saulmalek.com, shows some more information about me, my background, shows a few of the places where I've spoken. What I've been doing in the past couple of years has been primarily speaking at schools. So I've gone to a lot of high schools, gone to some college campuses,
Mhm.
and I've spoken to the students, sharing my story and opening them up to the possibility that this could be an issue, how it actually looked in my life, and then what the other side of it looks like in terms of getting clean and actually living a stable life. And what I've learned, or what I've just felt in my own speaking journey, is that abstaining from gambling, if you're addicted, is a great thing, but it's not the end game. And so, what I hope to bring to these campuses, to these schools, is the ability for kids to live a healthy, balanced life, not just a life where you're not gambling. Hey, plenty of people don't gamble and they don't know how to cope with life and they're miserable people. So I try to be a message of hope of how I've been able to live more comfortably, and a lot of that is from what I've gleaned from being in the 12 steps and Gamblers Anonymous, and just looking at other things in my life that are not balanced, and trying to become healthier, more tolerant of other people, less quick to anger, things like that. And I feel that now that I've gotten to a much better place in my own life, gambling does not look as attractive of an option, because just abstaining from gambling, if everything else is in shambles, gambling is going to still look like an attractive escape for me. But at
Wow.
the same time, I don't want to be sensationalist. And I don't say that every person who's ever gambled develops a severe addiction. I mean, there are people who do socially go once a year to Vegas and that's it. And there are people who make investments, 401k, or they put money away in some long term stocks. And so I think it's important too that kids get the full picture of what investing is, what good finances look like, because otherwise they're not getting the entire story. And I think they need the entire story. And then the choices are up to them, because there is no cure. I don't think there is a cure. Having a speaker come to a school is useful and it's very helpful and it gives a new perspective. But ultimately, the kids are going to decide what they're going to do.
I appreciate you so much saying that. That is something that we really try to stress is a speaker is really the spark to give that student, to give that young person that aha moment, that pause, that, I hadn't thought about that before. That's really what you want to do as a speaker when you're working with youth, is just to get them to go, I haven't really thought about that. That could be me, or I could do this better, or, to have them think things don't have to be the way they are. And then we need someone to intervene to carry them from that point going forward, to coach them to a better existence and stuff. So I really appreciate those things that you've said today. So, Salt, thank you for your commitment to sharing your story and being vulnerable about your story, and then feeling a calling and a passion to intervene in the lives of others, because, so many are going to say, hey, I got out of it. I don't want to ever do it. But you're like, hey, man, I want to help. I want to reach down and pull some people up. I want to talk to some folks about this. I got a feeling you're going to be a pioneer on a new frontier that we've yet to see. As sports betting sites begin to advertise more and they employ A-list celebrities to do their marketing for them, this is going to be an increasing problem.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I appreciate you saying that, and I try not to get too far in over my head, because someone asked me at the last school I spoke at in Houston, and kid said, "Well, have you recovered, or are you still in recovery?" And I said, "Hey, that's a good point, because the minute I say that I've graduated to some upper echelon or something and I'm better than all these kids, I just have been through it. I have more information, but I'm not cured." And I think the moment that I say I'm cured and I'm this guru or something, that's the first step to going right back into gambling. So
What a great perspective and great understanding of that. So thank you, Saul, for being there. Thank you, audience, for sticking with us. Listen, guys, if you've been with us for over 35 minutes, you really have found some value in what we're talking about, or you left it on by mistake and you don't know it's on. Either way, you're still here. And so what we like to do, we're going to ask you to do 3 things that we always ask. First off, like this on whatever podcast platform that you're listening to, whether it's audio or video, please like it. Second, comment. That's important, so we get feedback on it. But the most important one, and this is the most important one, and this is the one that Saul and I really want you to do, is share the episode. Because someone that you know is dealing with this, and they don't know about this episode. They don't know about how this can happen. And so we need to get the message to them so that they can start their journey of recovery. So please like, comment, and share on this. All the links to Saul and how to get in touch with him are going to be found in your show notes. If you're listening, go to your podcast app. You'll find it there. If you're watching on YouTube, you know the drill. Look straight down and hit the more, and you'll find all that information there. Saul, thank you so much for this. This has been insightful. Give me something to think about, too, about how to address this in a coaching manner as well. So thank you for your insights and giving me that pause of going, So I did it as well today. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. This is great. Really, really good discussion with you.
And thank you, audience, for sticking with us. And we'll be back very soon with another episode of the Generation Youth Podcast.